Thank you for that. Finally, Darren Henry.
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask Victoria first. The 2020 White Paper promised a comprehensive resources and skills strategy for the planning sector. So have you been involved in that development of such a strategy? Do you think it's important? And also, if you could just comment on the fact that in the White Paper it mentions that the local planning authority should have a chief officer for design and placemaking, but then that doesn't appear in the bill. Do you think it should, and should we legislate?
Well, thank you very much for the question, because it's one of my hot topics, the latter. But the former, absolutely. I'm delighted that we're now working with the department on a capacity and capability discussion, which I hope turns into a strategy very quickly. Has that happened as soon as it should have done? Probably not. But we're there now, and we're having a conversation with them about it. Because it has taken quite a while. You identified back in 2020, it was first mentioned. As a professional institute, we've just been getting on with stuff anyway, whether it's apprenticeships, a working partnership with public practice, bursaries, and trying to address the chronic lack of capacity going in. But of course there is a chronic underfunding of the public sector planning sector that we have seen really get a lot worse in recent years. We've done a lot of research on it. Total expenditure on planning by local planning authorities is now just 900 million across the whole of England. It equates to, I think, an average of about £5.50 per resident, where you just think that is the importance of planning and placemaking. It's a very low figure. So we urgently want to address the capacity and capability issues. Raising fees is part of it. That's going to be a key part of it to actually better resource it. But our number one sort of additional ask is we'll be making a submission to the Migration Advisory Committee this summer, I hope, to get town planning put back on the shortage occupations list. It was taken off in 2008. It was a big mistake. We waved goodbye to a lot of international planners who were holding up our planning department, and we'd like to welcome them back with open arms, because there's a lot of need for more planners here and internationally, I should say. But we are an attractive place for many of our international colleagues, so we would welcome any support the committee can give to the Migration Advisory Committee, that this is an important way that we could bring some skilled professionals back to the UK. On the business of the chief placemaker, chief planner, yes, I think you weren't here for my opening statement, but we were disappointed that it seems to have fallen by the wayside. It started out in the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission as recognising the importance of having somebody holding the ring locally. It made its way into the 2020 White Paper, Planning for the Future, and sadly it's now fallen out of the bill. In all of the things we've been discussing, it's hard to see, without having a chief placemaker, a chartered chief planner we would like, holding the ring and pulling it together and ensuring the funding resourcing is in place, ensuring that these important policy areas are driven forward. It's hard to see, in just sort of rolling the dice and seeing what happens, that will become a reality without having that very important position in place. We know it can be done. The Planning Bill Scotland introduced the legislation to require each planning authority to appoint a chief planning officer. If you have a statutory chief finance officer, why wouldn't you have a statutory chief planner whose business it is to make the important business of placemaking happen in the local area? Thank you.
Thank you. Christopher?
I think, first of all, on the chief placemaking officer, if that's something different from the chief planning officer, then I agree with that. You're not just going to change the name and say, well, we've created something new. Placemaking is vitally important, so that's two positions you're talking about. The second one is this issue about funding. We've all said, all three people this afternoon have said, there is a desperate need for funding. This is a bill about levelling up and regeneration. There's a lot in here that's very positive. You won't deliver it unless you have the people on the ground to deliver it through planning departments. There's 12 missions to levelling up. A lot of them go well beyond planning into health and education. But you need the resources in local government to do that, and planning is an absolutely fundamental part of that. Finally, it would be wrong not to say that there's a real recruitment problem with planning officers at the moment in all parts of the country. One of the problems they suffer, and my sister is a planning officer in Wales, and she says there's an awful amount of abuse from local people of planning officers, threatening to say that if they grant planning permission for new housing, that will lead to their children dying because of the more cars on the roads. You really should look into that, in my respectful submission, into the way in which planning officers are treated through the system. These are professional people. They should be respected for their expertise. It's they are incredibly motivated. I work with lots of them. I cross-examine some of them. I can respect them after I've cross-examined them. I hope it's the same as how they see me. But the reality is that they do an incredible job, and some of them are incredibly devoted. In Ellesmere Port, I've seen officers delivering at the Cheshire Oaks Village, incredibly dedicated officers who are so devoted to the job. It's disheartening when members ignore their recommendations, and that is becoming an increasing problem, even on allocated sites. That is a really depressing tendency. But this issue of abusing planning officers and being abusive to them, that is a real issue, which my sister is a planning officer of 30 years. She's got 8 years to go to retirement, she reminds me. She's hardened to the system, but a lot of the junior people who join them really find this completely and utterly upsetting and dispiriting, and something should be done about that. The Chief Planning Officer, Joanne Averley, has said that she's going to look into that, but support from your committee about how planning officers are treated would be very, very welcome.
Thank you. And finally to Hugh.
Yeah, just quickly, there is no doubt that there is a skills and capacity crisis. We, like Victoria, are involved in a process, but we've yet to see the strategy to go with that, or the resources that will be needed to go with it. But I think that in some of our interactions about that, and building on what Christopher just said about the reputation of planners, for me, this country has an amazing tradition in relation to shaping places that meet people's needs from Letchworth Garden City onwards. And yet the level of denigration about the planning service is huge. Where does all cultural change start? At the top. Well, read the introduction to the planning white paper, or comments that successive leaders and Secretary of States have made about planning being the enemy of enterprise. Or almost everything has been to denigrate what planning does. Planning at heart is simply answering this question: how are we going to organise ourselves to make ourselves fit for the future? How can planners enable people to find solutions to these problems? It is the answer to the question. It allocates 60 to 100,000 more units of housing every year than get built. So discuss where the problems lie. Actually, if you want a really successful country, you need a successful planning system. And that means that the Secretary of State, above all else, if they want to address recruitment, needs to make that speech about why a young person could possibly want to come into planning. I'm clear about that. I know Victoria's clear about that. I'm absolutely not sure that wider society is. We're an answer to a problem, an answer to a question, an enabler for communities, answers to strategic futures of this country. We are not, we're not something to be denigrated. Survival depends on the skills that we can bring to the table.
Okay, that seems a very positive note, I think, to finish on.